Welcome. In an era when a black president lives with his wife and kids in the White House, you would think a black couple in New York City could rent any apartment they could afford, or that gays, the disabled, or other minorities could too. Dream on. Today, housing discrimination 2013 style. Also on our agenda, a preview of a documentary about 4 young men determined to be good dads, despite the odds. In our public intellectual segment, where we look at research with the power to change our lives and public policy, the results of a 75-year study of men that has found some keys to a long and happy life. Plus, the 100th anniversary of the Spanish-language newspaper El Diario La Prensa. First, who among us cannot tell a horror story of house hunting in New York City? But not all of us share these kinds of experiences.
I was shown a nice apartment up on the top floor by the super of the building. We were looking around, you poking around as you do look in the closets and this and that. Oh, this looks nice. Yeah, okay, I gotta get my wife to come and see this. And we went over and looked out the window a little bit, and he looked around and he said, listen, I've been doing this for 30 years in this building, and I've never let one black person live here yet.
That is from the new documentary, A Matter of Place. The film, produced by the Fair Housing Justice Center, is about the added burden of buying or renting a home when you're African American, poor, or LGBT in present-day New York City. With us to share their stories which led to legal action, are Steve Brady, one half of the African American couple shown in the film, and Keith Short, also featured. A little later, Fred Freiberg, Field Services Director and co-founder of the Fair Housing Justice Center, will join us via phone. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for coming in.
Good to be here.
And Steve, tell us a little about your story. I think it's 2006, and you're looking to live in Park Slope.
Yes.
And you go to a rental agent?
We actually were looking on Craigslist, and we found an apartment, and this was a unique situation and circumstance insofar as the girl that was renting the apartment had broken her lease. And so it was incumbent upon her to then re-rent it to a new person to take over the lease. We happened to be the only ones that saw the apartment because that weekend there was a blizzard that occurred. So we were fortunate enough to be able to go in, and she said, look, you guys seem to me to be an ideal fit for this. Call the realty agency and you should be fine. So when we got home, we were like really excited, and we decided to call the realty agency on Monday, I believe, and everything was great. I told her about my credit score. It was pretty high. We had good income. We had good jobs. We had good references and credentials. Everything fit. And she told me, just bring in the application, your IDs, and we should be fine, and bring in the fees for processing.
This was the tenant, though, right?
Actually, this is the realty agency.
Oh, this is now at the realty agency. So you went in?
Yeah. So that morning when I went in, I asked for the person that I spoke to on the phone, and they looked at me strangely and said, yes, can I help you? And I said, hi, my name is Steve. I'm here to rent the apartment. We spoke yesterday. And the woman that was sitting there at the reception desk, oh, well, she said the copier is broken, so we can't take a photocopy of your IDs. And I thought that was peculiar, but I said, let me run out to a local shop, make a photocopy, and come back.
Hey, I'll do it for you.
Exactly. And she said, okay, fine. I went, made the copies, and when I came back, I was told that they're not going to take my money to process the application because there are other applications ahead of mine. I thought that that was very peculiar, but I wasn't 100% sure at the time, but I do distinctly recall being told by the tenant that we were the only people to ever see the apartment.
Keith, tell us about your experience, which was more of what's been characterized to me as poverty discrimination.
Yeah, what happened with me was I have a subsidy for an HIV subsidy. I'm HIV positive with AIDS and homeless. So there's a subsidy that allows us to have an apartment with 100% of the rent paid. So whenever I would go to realtors with this subsidy to say, I would like to rent this apartment or that apartment, they would simply tell me no. Even if it's covered by my subsidy, they would tell me no, and that they don't take program people, or they don't take programs, which is source of income discrimination. And I took them to court on the source of income discrimination. But the source of income discrimination is just simply another vehicle used for racial discrimination. Because most of the time when I speak to people who have been in my situation that were white, they would tell me, well, you could get an apartment here because you can afford it with the subsidy, but the realtor or the landlord won't accept you in this apartment, but they'll accept me because I'm white. So it's a very insidious thing.
Was this Park Slope incident the first time that you had faced housing discrimination, as far as you know?
It was not, but it took this incident for me to shake myself into reality and consciousness that this is as prevalent as it is. And Keith is absolutely correct. It's very, very, very subtle. You don't know for sure. And it was only in retrospect that I realized that I had been discriminated against in previous incidences.
How about for you? Have you faced this over and over again because of this program status?
At first when it happened, it was around 2009. I saw an apartment in Astoria that I really liked, and it was $1,150. My subsidy is up to $1,200. When I went to process for the apartment, I kept getting excuses of, well, there's another application on it before yours, you didn't pass the credit, and then finally they would say, we just don't take programs here. And that started happening everywhere. But when I did go to places that did accept the program and did accept subsidies, the apartments were always in, how should I say, they were in very bad neighborhoods, and the apartment building and the apartment itself was always in very bad condition. I had incidents where on my move-in day, I was supposed to move into an apartment, and on my move-in day, I walk into the apartment and there's a layer of roaches on the floor. There's somebody's clothes in the living room. I don't know whose clothes these were. There was somebody's clothes in the living room. The stove was pulled out of the wall. The refrigerator was disconnected. And when I went to tell the realtor, listen, this apartment isn't ready for habit to live in, they told me, well, all you have to do, Mr. Short, is sweep up the roaches and just push the refrigerator back up against the wall.
So in other words, even after they said yes
Yeah.
and rented you the apartment, they were making it clear that you were not welcome there.
Yeah, definitely not welcome.
And you told my producer, go ahead.
It's not that I wasn't welcome. It's that because I'm on a program or have a subsidy, that I wasn't a valuable person, that they could just throw me in an apartment and be okay with that.
And Steve, I think you told my producer that you felt that you had to prove to yourself that you were being discriminated against. What did you mean by that, and how do you prove that to yourself?
Sure. Well, I had to make sure that I did all the checks and balances necessary to ensure that everything is pretty, is valid. So we made efforts to call the woman that was showing us the apartment in order to ensure that we were the only ones that saw it, in order for her to validate that. Once that was established, we understood that, okay, there's something that should be done about this. We can't allow this we can't allow the realtor to get away with this. So we began to make a series of phone calls, and eventually we were referred to the Fair Housing Justice Center, and they were able to set us up with a great law firm that decided to take our case pro bono, and it was one of the best things we could have done.
And you too, same thing?
The same thing. I went to a place called Housing Works, because they had the word housing in it, so I said, well, they should probably be able to help me, and they referred me to the Fair Housing Justice Center, and they took the case pro bono as well.
And have your cases been resolved? Keith, has yours?
Well, mine has been resolved. I got a settlement on one of the realtors, and on a couple of other realtors, I got a judgment in my favor, but I kind of have mixed feelings about the judgment, because in general, the judgment was very good, because it told the realtors you can no longer say, no, we do not accept people who have a subsidy or people who are on a program, and you're supposed to post EEO boards or EEO brochures in your office and things of that nature. But on a personal level, I was a little disappointed, because when the judge did award me my judgment, he kind of awarded me based upon my actual losses, monetary losses. And because I'm poor, I don't really have actual monetary losses. But it's not so much about the actual monetary loss. It was about what I was worth, my value to the society and my value to the realtors.
Not to mention your time
Right,
and
right.
aggravation and lost housing.
Exactly.
That is
So
absolutely powerful, what you're saying here, the value and who you are as a human being.
there was no value to me, to the realtors at all. Everything that he said about what he has been discriminated with, that has happened to me, plus the income discrimination, and it's nowadays we no longer redline neighborhoods where it says, well, black people will live here and white people will live there. Instead, we're using other vehicles to do that, such as you didn't pass the credit check, which of course they'll never tell you exactly what's on your credit that didn't pass, or you haven't passed the employment check, or it's 15% of the rent, yearly rent. And I've even had one where,
The fee.
yeah, the fee. And then I even had one where once you go to see the apartment, which was $1,100, they'll say, oh, that was a mistake, it's really $1,400. So there's a whole bunch of vehicles used to keep us away
And
from
Steve, what's the status
housing.
of your case?
The status of my case is it was resolved and we had won the settlement. We're very happy that part of it really was focused on the realty office putting postings within their buildings saying that we don't discriminate based on race, gender, and a series of other things. So that's fantastic. And Keith, I just want to emphasize one of the points that you made that's fantastic, and that really is about our value as human beings.
Exactly.
And value as people. The Gettysburg Address, the 150th anniversary was just yesterday, and we continue to echo the phrase, all men are created equal. Well, that means all men are of value.
Amen. And now let's go to Fred Freiberg, Field Services Director and co-founder of the Fair Housing Justice Center. We're not showing his face as Fred is still active in the field as a tester of housing discrimination. But Fred, hello. Thank you very much for coming on our program.
Hello, it's good to be on the program.
And tell our viewers, what exactly is a tester? How do you test? What do you test exactly?
Well, testers are people who are trained to pose as prospective buyers or renters of real estate for the purpose of identifying possible violations of fair housing laws. Essentially, they simulate ordinary consumer transactions, and based upon their experience, it makes it possible for us to determine whether people are being afforded the same treatment, service, information, and ultimately access to housing.
And how often, or I should say, how do you decide who to test, which landlords or realtors or whoever it is you're actually going to do this test on?
Well, there's two types of testing that most private fair housing organizations engage in. One is in response to complaints, such as those filed by Steve and Keith. We did testing in response to their complaints to try and gather corroborative evidence. And in these two cases, we were successful in doing so. The other way we do it is to basically develop and design and implement systemic testing investigations, which are more proactive, where we go in and look at a particular segment of the housing market because maybe housing patterns look suspicious, maybe there's other information that's come to our attention that leads us to believe that it would be productive to look at housing market practices in those areas.
And in those cases, do you do sort of double-blind studies where you send in a white person and a black person whose, various qualifications are equivalent?
Well, that's the way quite a bit of testing works. It's not so much double-blind as it is you have two people who are matched up perhaps on every socioeconomic characteristic except the one protected characteristic for which the test is being conducted. So
in this case, skin color.
In this case, skin color, or in Keith's case, it had to do with source of income. You can do it on disability, on a variety of factors that are all protected by fair housing laws.
And so do you have stats that you release on the prevalence of this kind of discrimination, these various kinds of housing discrimination, or do you more target individuals when you find them?
Well, our resources are so sparse that we focus primarily on using those resources for enforcement purposes, not so much for studies or evaluations or measurements. we frankly wouldn't have the capacity to come up with an accurate measurement of discrimination in the marketplace. But we do a lot of investigations where we target areas or segments of the housing market for testing in order to identify and eliminate discriminatory housing practices that still persist.
Which branch of government enforces on this?
Well, there's a couple different agencies that are very involved in enforcement of fair housing laws. The main agency that's mentioned directly in the Fair Housing Act is the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and they're the administrative agency that enforces the law, and they fund many of the
federal.
testing organizations around the country. The other agency is the Department of Justice, which has always had what's called pattern and practice authority to investigate discrimination that more broadly impacts housing markets and groups of people in our society.
And before you two go, why did you want to participate in this documentary? You risk bringing more suspicion by people who don't like those who report, or shame by people who may consider it shameful, or whatever the risk, however you want to characterize the risk. There's some risk.
Sure. There was enormous risk that allowed me to be in the position that I'm in today. Enormous risk that was taken throughout the 60s. My parents, when they immigrated to this country, they went through a number of different situations where they were truly discriminated against, and they worked hard for me to be able to have what I have. So in honor of their, of their efforts, I must, push on.
And I wanted to bring to the awareness of the people who are being discriminated against that there is some recourse that you can take, that you don't have to put up with this. And you can go to the Fair Housing Justice Center and you can document, and tell somebody what happened to you. And hopefully they'll know to have some type of recourse for the discrimination. And also to let the realtors know to not continue to discriminate against us. And we're not going to put up with this.
People are watching
you.
Exactly.
So Fred, where can people watch this documentary?
Well, they can watch it on our website now. It's posted on our website at www.fairhousingjustice.org, and that's the easiest place to access the film.
Well, very powerful. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Daddy, Don't Go. That's the title of a feature-length documentary from our next guest that sets out to illustrate the day-to-day struggle that many men face in their attempts to be good dads. And for good reason. The presence of a father in a child's life has been found to have an influence on numerous social issues facing an increasing number of Americans, including poverty, jail time, educational achievement, teen pregnancy, drug and alcohol abuse, and overall health. Filmmaker Emily Apt is in our studio to tell us about her project that is chronicling the lives of 4 New York City dads struggling to live up to their potential in the face of many obstacles. Thank you for coming in. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And let's start right out by viewing the trailer for the film.
Too many fathers are MIA, missing from too many lives and too many homes.
It used to be that this was mostly an African-American phenomenon. It is not anymore.
The statistics of men in prison is directly related to fatherless homes. It is an epidemic.
I told myself, I'm not gonna be no deadbeat father. Like, for me to be a deadbeat father, I gotta be dead and somebody gotta beat me up.
If I gotta go to jail, I'll go to jail for my kids. Any day of the week, I'll go to jail for them.
I fought to get my kids, I fought to get them out of foster care, I fought to get them help. I can't sleep until I know my kids is coming.
You have a baby. You don't live for yourself anymore, you have to live for your kid.
It'd be bad for her to go to foster care because nobody understands Milagros like me.
Her hair look pretty. I wonder who did that.
You did that.
The reality is that his fear is well-founded and that he could lose his children in an instant.
I just wish I would have done something differently. Not to keep us together for my sake, to keep us together for my son.
He ain't do what he got to do. I'm doing what I got to do for mine and his. Until he does something, that's my daughter.
Nelson wanted to be a father not just to Brandon, but to all 3 children.
What I want is to get some permanent housing, get about this shelter place, just move on with my life.
I think in the end, with him actually being arrested and going away, that saved his life.
People don't want to hire an ex-felon. They don't care if you were 16 years old. They don't care if it was non-violent. They just look at it like this guy was in prison.
It's real hard out here to get a job. It does make me feel going back to my old ways, but I choose not to. It's not just me no more, I have a family.
What should I do with you? If you don't want to lose your son, then you do what you need to do not to lose him. Do you understand me?
Yes. Stop. I gotta make a way for me and my child. I gotta make sure he's taken care of the way he needs to be taken care of.
Scenes from the documentary, Daddy Don't Go. Filmmaker Emily Apt with us. This was an issue 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20, 25, 30 years ago. Why did you want to make this film now?
Well, I'm very interested in stereotypes and specifically making films that challenge them. And I actually used to be a caseworker many years ago. I'm a longtime New York City resident, been here for 20 years. And my first film was about my former clients as they were transitioning from welfare to work. And I was really challenging the stereotypes around welfare recipients back then, and I'm hoping to do that again with this film.
And what are the stereotypes, and of whom, that you're trying to shatter?
Well, I think there's this prevailing notion of the deadbeat dad. And I think there's a really negative association between low-income, no-income fathers and being that. And so what we're trying to do with this film is replace that negative stereotype with a positive one and say that, you know, just because you don't have stable work, just because you aren't a provider in the traditional sense of the word, maybe you can't even pay your child support, but you can still be a really great father. So that's the message we're really trying to put out there with the film.
President Obama was the first voice in the trailer.
Yeah.
And I want to tell you a story. I was at the Democratic Convention in 2008 in Denver and was there for his convention speech. And the line that got the most applause was not any of the policy items that he was listing in that election of hope and change, but the line in which he said, fathers should be present to take care of the children. And that very diverse, racially, ethnically, socioeconomically crowd that had come to Denver as delegates gave him the biggest round of applause for that line than for any other. I don't know if you're aware of that moment, but he spoke those words. Why is he an important figure?
Well, I am very much appreciative of President Obama's outspokenness around this issue. And in fact, he's the first president to sort of proudly declare that he is a father, and everything he says about being his most important job, I think is really profound and marks a huge sort of cultural shift. So I'm a big fan of Obama's, a loyal supporter, I should say, and so I am aware of that moment. And he kicked off something called the Fatherhood Initiative a few years back, and there's been a lot of support for that. And we also have a local version that was pioneered by Bloomberg, actually. And I think you know, it's a really important force for good. There is a lot more funding that's dedicated to father-friendly programs, but we also have a long way to go.
But do Obama and you start at almost opposite poles? Because he seemed to be scolding fathers who are deadbeat dads,
yeah,
and saying, you guys better get with your kids if you know what's right for them and for society in our country. You seem to be saying, people keep calling folks deadbeat dads when you want to, you know, purvey a stereotype that's the opposite.
Well, I think I want to draw attention to what I see as two parallel truths that are sort of surround this issue. And I think on one hand, fatherlessness is a huge issue, especially in New York City. Basically, a third of children are growing up without dads, and for African American children, it's 50%, Latino kids, it's 40%. So this is a real ongoing issue. But on the other hand, the more and more dads are stepping up and fighting for custody and actually taking on the role of single parent. So I want those guys to be appreciated and sort of held up as the positive example that they are. So for me, I made the film in homage to the young guys you see in the city pushing baby strollers, and the young men that are really standing up and showing up for their children against the odds. But I also want the film to be a reminder to those dads who aren't present. And I want them to look at the stories in our film and say, damn, if they can do it, and be present for their children despite all these major issues, then I should be able to as well.
So you have 4 guys who you portray in the film, profile in the film.
Yeah.
Tell us about one of them. Pick one.
Oh God, that's challenging. Yeah, so it's 4 fathers, and it's very important to us that we sort of hit all the demographics. So 2 of our fathers are African American, 1 is Latino, 1 is Caucasian. And so I guess I'll talk about Roy. Roy is an ex-offender. He's white. He's from Long Island. Sort of at first glance, you might think of him as sort of a middle-class guy, but he's actually really struggling. He has sole custody of his 3-year-old, which happened because the child's mother basically has drug issues. Then, he was in a difficult situation, made more difficult by the fact that he has a record. So he has employment issues, which you see a lot of the men in our film are sort of grappling with. But to make matters even more worse and more difficult, he basically suffered from a work-related accident. So his situation couldn't be more dire, couldn't be more difficult, yet he has found a way to really show up and be present for his child day after day.
How about
against the odds.
one more, one of the dads who is not custodial?
Okay. Well, we're also following the story of Omar. And Omar does have current custody of his children, but he's fighting neglect charges that were brought against him by ACS. And he faces those charges.
And that's the Administration for Children's Services, yes. ACS, branch of city government. Go ahead.
Yes. And he faces those charges basically because he was bringing his children to school late and was said to not be responsive when the teachers called his attention to this. But what we found when we started following his story was that it was virtually impossible for him to get his children to school on time. One of his children has severe behavioral issues. The 2 schools that his children attend are an hour and a half apart. And so when you kind of peel the layers back and you really look at these stories, you see that these guys really have major challenges they're dealing with.
So this film, we should say, is not yet completed, and you have a Kickstarter campaign going to raise enough money to finish it. What do you want to say about that?
Yeah, well, most independent filmmakers nowadays have day jobs. It's not easy to fund and make films. So we decided to launch a Kickstarter campaign to help us finish the film. So if you go to Kickstarter and you put in Daddy Don't Go, you can see our trailer. And we're really pleased with how it's going. Our goal is $80,000. And we basically need to reach that in less than 2 weeks. But we've so far raised about $55,000. So the support has been overwhelming and really encouraging.
Daddy Don't Go, filmmaker Emily App. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Up next, is there a formula for men's happiness? Harvard's 75-year-long study of adult development. Time now for Public Intellectual, our series that looks at research with the power to change our minds and public policy. Today, a study about happiness, which asks the question, is there a formula for a good life? But it's not just any study, it's Harvard's so-called grant study of adult development. That's been tracking the emotional and physical health of hundreds of Harvard men for 75 years, looking for factors that might predict well-being. Psychiatrist George Vallant has led the study for nearly half a century. In his recent book, Triumphs of Experience, he explores not just the study's latest findings, but his own maturation personally. Dr. Vallant joins us via Skype from Orange, California. Hello from New York. Thank you so much for doing this with us.
Hello, I'm here.
Do you find, first of all, that there is one most essential ingredient for a happy, contented life?
Yes, I think there is. The capacity to form and absorb lasting human relationships.
That's a pretty fundamental one. How do you measure that in a 75-year study?
Well, you really do it by listening to stories, not mathematics. When you put a life together and you've known that person for 70 years, the story of their life conveys either that they've spent a miserable life pushing people away, or they're like most of us, some good, some bad, and other people who just have a magnetic capacity to trust other people and to take what they offer inside.
And you track these men's experience with respect to human relationships over the course of their lifetime. So, for example, I see that you rank their childhoods on a scale from cherished to loveless. How do you measure that?
Well, you know, you try to reduce love to numbers, and you look at the relationship with the mother, with the father, with the siblings, the cohesiveness of the home, their adolescent success in a social rather than scholastic sense in high school, and then ask the rater if they'd like to have that childhood themselves. And you give each of those 5 points, and you end up with a scale from 1 to 25.
And so, for example, you find closeness with one's father is important for happiness as an adult. Is that primarily closeness with one's father as a child?
Yes, no. This closeness with both parents really was, as we measured it and knew about it, and the men talked about it, more important in childhood than in adulthood. But what was interesting was that the men's closeness with their mother did not predict marital success, but financial success, and closeness to one's father predicted marital success and success at playing, taking vacations.
How do you explain that?
Well, I really don't, because it wasn't what I expected to find. And I think that the famous Alexander the Great's mother whispering into his ear, "You're a god, you're a god," and Sigmund Freud's mother calling him Der Golden and Siggy, helped both men achieve a great deal. And I think that a man's father being close to him gives him the, I suppose, the courage to be himself. And that plays out in both marriages and recreational life.
And yet, this long 75-year study certainly does not find that men, as they age through adulthood, are determined, their fates are determined by their childhoods. They can evolve, they can transcend that, they can learn in adulthood, correct?
Oh, absolutely. That childhood is simply a dramatic way of illustrating that it's the good things that happen to us that shape our lives and not the bad things, so that there were many men who had really, at 25, were no-hopers, who at 80 were people that you would love to know. And the ills that turned men who were destined for glory at 35 into no-hopers at 70 were largely alcoholism, major depressive disorder, and then at the end of life, Alzheimer's.
And what are the factors that seem to correlate with longevity itself? Not simply how happy somebody is, but also how long they live.
Well, the most important thing not to do is to lose control of alcohol. And that doesn't mean try not to be a daily drinker. It means to make sure that you're in control of your use of alcohol. And this really is one of the great lessons of the study, because most studies have asked men how much they drink and how often they drink. And that's really irrelevant, partly because people are liars, and partly because alcoholics, like fat people, go on diets. And what's important is, does alcohol mess up your parental life, your marital life, your occupational life, and get you DWIs?
How has your own aging influenced your view of these questions or of your data?
Oh, my own aging has made an enormous difference, but it's much more that the data has shaped my aging rather than my being shaping the data by getting older.
How so? How has the data shaped your own aging, your own life?
I was terrified of old age before I was 50. I thought after 50, life was all downhill. And I thought that anybody that got divorced was personality disorder. And by following lives into 60 and 70, I found not only did marriages get better after 70 statistically, but the men who got remarried, even several times, ended up at the end of life being happily married for 3 or 4 decades, and that the ride from 70 to 90 is a pretty good ride. At the end of life, I mean, the last 2 years of life, whether you die at 60 or 100, suck. But as long as you aren't in the last 2 or 3 years of your life, growing old is just as much fun as growing young.
And to do well past age 60, the biographies in your study suggest it helps to be in good health, and I'm reading from your list, in good health, close to your kids between the ages of 60 and 75, availability of social supports other than your wife and kids between the ages of 60 and 75, the good marriage between 60 and 85, also mattering, and the earned income being in the study's top quarter. So all of those factors contribute to happiness and longevity over 60?
No, let me correct that a little bit. Earned income didn't mean very much, except that people that made a lot of money were often good at getting along with people. Retirement income correlates very low with retirement happiness. And what is most important about retirement is, one, knowing how to play, and two, being able to continue to take people inside, so that as friends die, forming new relationships and being receptive to new relationships, and perhaps equally important, although I can't prove it in my study, is not to take yourself too damn seriously.
One of the concepts in the study is career consolidation. What is career consolidation?
Career consolidation is having a job at which you are contented, at which you are committed, to which you are committed, at which you are competent, and for which you're compensated. And this means that being a housewife may or may not meet all those criteria, and that it isn't the job doing the job for the paycheck, but it's these 4 C's of contentment, compensation, competence, and I don't remember the other because I'm almost 80 years old.
But you've got the idea across. I'm thinking of how you evaluated the man named Charles Boatwright, one of your subjects, and your evaluation of him seemed to change over time from your earlier evaluation decades ago to now. Is that correct?
Well, and that was partly me growing up, and psychiatrists and psychologists have a lot of trouble recognizing mental health. So that, and they understand mental illness just fine, but when someone says they're happy and they're contented and they really like what they're doing, we're tempted to say they're in denial. And Charles Boatwright was a man who had many different jobs, and he never had very many telephones on his desk. And he never made a very large income. But it was clear from the age of 25 on, what gave him satisfaction was doing things for other people and being helpful to other people. So that even though he was in business, his career really was much more like a physician or a high school teacher. And it was interesting that the high school teachers came out at the very top of adjustment and happiness, because the essence of life life before 35 is get ahead as fast as you can. I mean, that makes life easier.
And in fact, if I understand correctly, the young George Vaillant, you had a hard time recognizing the mental health of Charles Boatwright because you were ambitious.
That's right, and he wasn't. But after 50, to keep it, you have to give it away.
So in sum, to quote the Beatles twice, all you need is love, and once you're old enough to realize it, life is a long and winding road.
Well, there's no question that life, personalities change. We're not set in plaster, and we're not going to be the same people at 60 as we were at 25.
Thank you for your work, and thank you for talking to us. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you for letting me be here.
It's the 100th anniversary of La Prensa, the largest Spanish language daily in New York City and the oldest in the country. These days, part of El Diario La Prensa. They're celebrating with a series of ongoing exhibits throughout the city and an online retrospective showcasing a century of Latin identity in New York. And some of that will be shared today. With us, Javier Gomez, project director of El Diario's Centennial, who started out nearly 20 years ago as an intern, and Angel Vasquez, marketing manager of El Diario La Prensa. Welcome, both of you. And let's get right to it with our first image, and we'll have conversation as we go. So we're going to put this up on the screen. And what are we looking at?
Oh, we are actually looking at an ad. It is an ad from 1924 that has a replica of what the first cover of El Diario looked back right in 1913. Basically, back then it was called La Prensa, and it was a weekly newspaper that catered primarily to the growing Spaniard population in New York. They worked mainly in factories, manufacturing, a lot of tobacco factories. They were gravely concerned about what was going on back in Europe. So back then they still had readers. So they would hire people to read El Diario for them.
What do you mean readers? They would hire people to
They would
read?
hire people to read for them as they worked.
Oh.
And El Diario actually was a
That's
response
because it was before the
to
radio.
that growing need, of course.
So that was the entertainment, the
The
accompaniment.
entertainment
Well,
for the
what was the
factories
first?
working.
What was the first headline? I can't read it.
Actually, it's very impossible to read. As a matter of fact, El Diario for the centennial hired a researcher who spent for about 6 months, right, in the vaults, investigating and reading. So we haven't been able to retrieve and understand the first headline, but we understand someone has a front page in Spain, and we're going after it.
Somebody's got it.
Yes.
Someday you'll find
Yes.
it. All right, image number 2. And this, I believe, is Brady and Migrantes when it comes up. And so tell us, what is this story about?
That was an accident that the railroad had, and we were putting the headlines about how many people died in that accident. What is curious about this page is that you combine a local story with a Latin American story, where they say tomorrow we will see the results of El Salvador electoral process, and also about a series of actions that the police was having in New York City to do, how you will say...
They were doing like raids. This is the front page from, I think, 1931. And El Diario is raising major concerns about what the newspaper described at the time as a growing anti-immigration sentiment in the city. And the newspaper, in the article to the left, is actually denouncing a series of raids that immigration, combined with city authorities, were doing in places that were known for immigrants to hang out, meaning like bars and inn houses, that kind of stuff.
Pool houses. It was a little bit of profiling back then, so it started.
I'm shocked to hear that such a thing would go on. So if the audience in 1913 was mostly immigrants from Spain, who was the audience in 1931 reading that paper?
In 1931, we already have a big movement of immigrants from the Caribbean area. A lot of Puerto Ricans, Dominican Republics were coming to the city looking for jobs, looking for opportunities to better their families and life opportunities. So there was a moment, there was a struggle between La Prensa and the community, because they were not feeling it was the same interest. And that's why in the 40s, they found El Diario, which it was a voice for the Caribbean community, especially the Puerto Rican community in the city. Eventually, in the 60s, those two papers merged, and that's how El Diario La Prensa come along. So they give us the challenge today to talk to a very diverse community and work with the different backgrounds and different point of view to kind of define what Latino means in New York City today.
Image number 3. Let's see what we have here.
Oh, that's sweet. This is one of the celebrations of one of our anniversaries. The President Roosevelt has sent a congratulatory letter to the paper for their 25th anniversary. I'm happy to inform that this year we also received a letter from the President Barack Obama celebrating El Diario for our 100th anniversary.
Oh, you did?
So it's been, when we went back to the archives, it was being kind of like custom for the presidents to recognize a milestone within the paper story and history. So when we reached out to the White House, they were really happy to contribute for the 100th anniversary. So we're really happy.
All right, let's go right on to the next image and see what we've got as we continue to take a little tour through history via El Diario La Prensa. Aha,
That is Fidel Castro's first arrival in New York as newly self-appointed, shall I say, dictator of Cuba. He basically arrived at Penn Station from Washington, and there were 20,000 people around the block to meet the leader.
What year?
That's a front page from, I think, 1959.
Oh, so he
April
would have been
1959.
brand new after the revolution. All right, let's go on. We've seen Fidel in New York here, greeted by 20,000. This is very timely this week.
Yes, we were looking at all the media talking about the 50th anniversary of the assassination on JFK, and this is the cover that El Diario published that day. JFK has been a very iconic image for the Latino community. They identify with this president, and it touched very close to them when he was assassinated. So it's really remarkable when you see that the entire full cover of El Diario that day was dedicated to that particular news.
Another politician, an important one in New York City.
The El Diario, La Prensa's photo archives, has these jewels of community mementos from New York City, and this is one of our favorites. This shows Mayor David Dinkins. I think that is the Puerto Rican Day Parade in 1990, before it became the National Puerto Rican Day Parade, and he's just hanging out and having a blast, holding a young child and celebrating with the crowd.
I don't think I've ever seen the very serious David Dinkins with a bigger smile on his face. Let's keep going.
This is actually a very important front page for Hispanic community history in the city. It documents the election of Germán Badillo as Bronx Borough President, first Hispanic Puerto Rican Borough President. He was not the first Hispanic elected official in New York City or New York State, though, but the importance about this election was that it marked the very first step in the career of who would, 5 years later, become the first Puerto Rican elected to Congress.
And Badillo, who then referred to himself to me many times as the president of the Bronx, referring to those days. Okay, keep going. What do we have here?
That was a really important cover for us as well. That's when the courts announced the resolution of the Young Lords case. And they were exonerated for 150 charges when they took the church and protested for getting better service in education and community service. So for us
they were sort of the Black Panthers of the Puerto Rican community.
Yeah, kinda.
They had actually occupied a local church for 11 days in East Harlem, the Methodist Church, and they were charged for it. Of course, they didn't mean any harm. They were using the church to provide community services, but of course the courts weren't happy. That was the front page of their exoneration.
What would a slideshow be without Miss Universe?
Yeah, that actually is our first Puerto Rican Miss Universe, but the most important part is that we have Badillo next to her, and also the governor, right?
Yes, that's Governor Rockefeller. And that photo, I think, is circa October 1970, and it was a private campaign event that Governor Rockefeller threw himself in celebration of Germán Badillo's candidacy for Congress. He wasn't elected yet. About 3 weeks or 4 weeks later, he was elected. Now, the lady you see talking to the governor right there, that is Luisa Quintero, one of the most influential Hispanic journalists in the history of this city.
I only met Badillo as a much older man. He's so dashing there.
Yes.
And that's what is interesting about these exhibitions that we have tried to put together. We found out in this process that because we are on a daily operation, we really don't have the time to really take care and look back to all the history that we've been building through the years. And we wanted to somehow preserve that history. So we work very, very close with Columbia University and CUNY and NYU to make sure that we have this opportunity for the people to see those moments.
We only have time for one more image. So what have we here?
This is actually a group of people in the Lower East Side who didn't have heat in their building, and El Diario was putting a story for solving their issues. That's why we are called a campeón de los hispanos, the champion of Hispanics. We were always looking for problems to solve in the community.
For this particular story, El Diario joined forces with Al Green, the Congress member, and basically they summoned the press to go there and denounce the conditions in which these residents were living.
Well, 100 years of El Diario La Prensa and an increasingly Latino, increasingly complex, with so many nationalities represented, plus Puerto Rico. It is another 100 years of El Diario La Prensa to come, I would imagine.
We hope.
Thank you for sharing the past, and good luck in the future.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And that's our program for this week. We debut a new show at this time each week, and tune into my daily radio show, 10 a.m. to noon on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.